just want to concur with Ben and reiterate and wish everybody a very warm welcome to this event with Miranda. I can't really echo the words of Series Ed's Professor Jonathan Wooding that he writes in the preface to the book, that Miranda needs no introduction at all to any reader of the study of Celtic religion. I know throughout her career, which Ben has just summarised very nicely, she's made an invaluable and lasting contribution to her chosen field. And I think the fact that she has written for a diverse range of publishers, including Yale University Press, British Museum, Thames and Hudson, and UWP, shows that she can write obviously scholarly research books, but also more accessibly written books for people who are interested in the Druids, and I think it's a real skill. And just touching again on the many accolades and awards that Miranda has achieved in her career, and Ben mentioned the Society for American Anthropology Prize, and the fact that she's been at the guest lecturer at such august institutions as the Smithsonian. Thank you to Cardiff for hosting this event. It's very fitting, as Miranda is a Professor Emerita here. And, you know, reading the book, I think it's a real testament to her skill as an author in her deft and accessible reconsideration of the Druids. She really is truly rethinking this mysterious and powerful body that we know as the Druids. I think it's got real potential to be a groundbreaking contribution to the field, overturning the views of the ancient classical authors and pinning them down with hard archaeological evidence to paint a very different picture. And I just want to say, Miranda, thank you so much for choosing UWP as your publisher. It was wonderful working with you doing this book through those long, dark days of lockdown. Your enthusiasm and care and real desire to make the book accessible was very apparent to me. And I hope our collaboration continues well into the future. Thanks, Miranda, you've been wonderful to work with, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll hand you over to Miranda now, because I'm sure she can present what she's going to say much better than I can about her subject. And she is the main event tonight, so I'll hand over to you, Miranda.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words. I feel exactly the same about the press. They were long, dark days, weren't they? And occasionally we had to go to each other's houses and hand over drawings or other material at arm's length, trying not to breathe in each other's faces and give each other COVID. So the whole thing was all a bit bizarre and a bit surreal.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for hosting this event. I'm just going to say just a very few words to start about the book, and then I want to say a few thank yous. So, Rethinking the Ancient Druids seeks to provide an archaeological footprint, perhaps left behind by this enigmatic priesthood, which is mentioned by so many writers from the classical world. Their possible material remains range from shrines to divining spoons, and from headdresses to human sacrifice. A new approach taken here is to put Wales centre stage, for archaeological evidence suggests that such a position may well possess validity, and if so, it chimes with Tacitus's testimony concerning the Druidic Holy of Holies on the island of Anglesey. And I'm just going to read you Tacitus's comment about this particular Holy of Holies on Anglesey. If I can find it. So Suetonius planned to attack the island of Mona, this is in AD 60, which, although thickly populated, had also given sanctuary to many refugees. Flat-bottomed boats were built to contend with the shifting shallows, and these took the infantry across. Then came the cavalry. Some utilised fords, but in deeper water, the men swam beside their horses. The enemy lined the shore in a dense armed mass. Among them were black-robed women with dishevelled hair like furies, brandishing torches. Close by stood Druids, raising their hands to heaven and screaming dreadful curses. I want to make it clear from the outset that this book confines itself to the ancient world of the Druids, seeking to avoid what Jonathan Wooding, the series editor of in which this book is placed, seeking to avoid long Druidism, by which I mean discussion of Druidic reinventions from the medieval and Renaissance periods to the present day. This is not what this book is about. But before proceeding further in this introduction to the book, it is my pleasure to express my gratitude to all the individuals and institutions who have made both the book and this somewhat eccentric version of a launch possible. Thanks to Ben Jervis and the Department of Archaeology at Cardiff University for hosting the event. My sincere thanks go to the University of Wales Press for taking on for the editing and the production of this volume. A nicer group of publishing people I have yet to meet. I am extremely grateful to so many of people, institutions and individuals for their generosity in providing images and often waiving reproduction fees and allowing me to use quotations from their work. And I wish to mention by name those who drew images for me for this book: Nick Griffiths, Anne Lever, Paul Jenkins and Ian Dennis. And not least, my thanks go to Dr. Derek Dye, who made the hazardous climb up a Gower cliff face to photograph an inaccessible cave for me. Thank you. So back to Druids. The interest in this subject is wide, and of course many books and papers have been written about them. Everyone's heard of them, yet they are elusive creatures, remaining shrouded in mystery and uncertainty. So what's this book about and what's new about it? The first part sets the scene for the archaeological discourse by considering the substance and value of the classical literature, the theme that formed the backbone of Nora Chadwick's seminal study, The Druids, published by the University of Wales Press in the mid-1960s. My intention in this current work has been to provide the Druids with an archaeological voice, and so to produce what is in effect, I hope, a humble hope, a companion volume to Chadwick's treatise. Recent work on ancient written testimony has shone new light on the way in which these Greek and Roman texts should be viewed, which will impact upon the archaeology too, but including the need to recognise how much of this so-called testimony on Gaul and Britain is grounded not just in first-hand witness or travellers' tales about the barbarian lands of the Druids, but also in descriptions of Gallo-British customs, including religious material, that are now perceived to reflect interpretations distorted by lenses of familiarity with Greco-Roman practices and mores. However, my take on classical texts that mention Druids, and in particular that of Julius Caesar, is that Druids did exist, that they were essentially theocrats whose influence and importance went far beyond the limits of religious authority. One little aside is that sometimes experimental archaeology can provide an interesting set of pieces of knowledge. In 2019, I was invited by a film company to go and film on Anglesey and to do a reconstruction of the wicker man that Caesar mentions and Strabo mentions too. This huge wicker image, apparently, that was filled with human beings and sometimes animals, which was then set fire to as a sacrifice. So it was our task in this film to recreate this, not with people, sadly, but with a wicker image that we could put on the shore of Anglesey facing to the mainland. We realised it wasn't very easy to make a wicker man. They're very lightweight for a start. They tend to fall over. And of course, filling them with people and animals would make them very top heavy, and it would be very difficult to keep them upright. It was also extremely difficult to set light to them, particularly where there was a wind. But in the end, we managed to set light to this wicker man by night, and it made him a wonderful spectacle. Very similar to the spectacle in the 1973 lovely film, The Wicker Man. But this by night was a wonderful and horrifying sight. And I do wonder whether if there were wicker men in Druidic times in ancient Britain, they might have chosen night to make such a spectacle of this image. And so to the archaeology. By far the most material with which this book is concerned is provenanced in Gallia and Britannia, where classical authors firmly situate the Druids. Occasionally, there is an excuse to wander further into Europe, but only where there is material that accords closely with that of Gaul and Britain. The question needs to be posed as to how good a fit there is between classical literature and archaeology. This is very variable, but as the quotations from ancient texts sprinkled about the book suggest, there is at least some congruence, one with the other. So I will now take you on a brief journey through the archaeology discussed in the book. May I have slide 1, please, Ben? After the first 2 chapters that interrogate the literature, following sections explore sacred places where built or natural shrines such as groves and caves and watery places, and the rites that might be identifiable therein. I'm cheating here. This should be a picture of the Culverhole cave where 2 figurines were found, one dating to the 7th century BC of a lunar goddess, and the other from the Roman period depicting a mother goddess. But sadly, the Culverhole cave itself has been built up, bricked up, made into a dovecote, and does not provide a very nice image of a sacred and secret cave. So instead, this is a picture of the Smuggler's Cave that is included in the book, just to show how interesting and inaccessible some of these places might be. After looking at these shrines, I then go on to a discussion of relevant Iron Age iconography, images and portable art, such as that on coins, next slide please, jewellery and martial equipment. Light is thrown on specific aspects of cult expression, including shape-shifting in images that cross human and animal boundaries in a shamanistic way, perhaps, and exhibit other surrealism that you can see here on this coin from Cirencester, such as triplism. Look at the triple-tailed horse on this reverse of the coin minted by Bodvok, one of the leaders of the Dubunni. And the emphasis on the human head, which is stressed in classical literature. Next slide, please. This is an oversized, it's bigger than a life-size head, and it was found reused in a wall at Brynamore Farm on the island of Anglesey. And it's quite clear from the way it's been depicted that it belongs to the late Iron Age or the Roman period. And it's one of several from Anglesey, indeed. And I want you to keep, once I come off that slide, I want you to keep that in your head just for the time being. It's in chapter 5 that Wales's possible centrality is argued. We've got this picture, this wonderful image from Anglesey. And some of the Laterne decorated metalwork here is demonstrably very early in the dating sequence. The Technologies of Enchantment project showed it had this huge radiocarbon dating sequence from Iron Age art with organic material attached, showing that it's actually very early. And I think a lot of this art is symbolic and associated with religion. Important objects include ritual headdresses. Next slide, please. Including this reconstructed wonderful headdress from Cerrig-y-Drudion in North Wales, which used to be considered to be a hanging bowl, but has been beautifully reconstructed for the Origins Gallery, which is sadly now closed at the National Museum, showing this splendid piece of art with its horsehair plume and its decorated metalwork and its shining gold wheels attached to it. That dates to the 4th century BC. We also from Wales have decorated pairs of spoons, which I'll go on to a little bit later, and the sacred material from Llancerrig Bach. Do we have a trumpet, Ben? Yes, we do. Wonderful. This is just one of the many pieces of wonderful material from Llancerrig Bach, a little boggy lake on Anglesey, which contained masses of material, beautifully decorated military material, and including animal bones and also a little bit of human bone as well, and 2 huge slave gang chains. And one wonders whether the human material was once encapsulated or imprisoned within one of these chains. And of course, we go back to Tacitus placing the Druidic holiest place on Anglesey. It is perhaps no chance that Anglesey has produced such rich material. And the next slide, please. And rather like the Brynamore Farm head, we have other stone heads from Anglesey that I've tentatively identified as oracle stones because of their open mouths. And you can imagine that perhaps people, priests, maybe stood behind these stones and spoke through them as if to provide oracles. And of course, we have the sacred places such as Culverhole, and stretching the boundaries a bit, Lindo Man, that I think is associated with the need to produce a crisis sacrifice, an aversion sacrifice, perhaps to stop the Druids being overwhelmed on Anglesey by the Romans. There follows a discussion concerning possible links between the Druids and Boudica, suggesting that the violent clashes between Britain and Rome, next slide please, in and around AD 60, might be seen in terms of a holy war, perhaps inflamed by Druidic jihadists, and positing the notion that Boudica herself might have held religious office because of her apparent prowess at divination, as chronicled by Dio Cassius. And the archaeological evidence supports divinatory and possibly shamanistic practices in Gaul and Britain in the late Iron Age and Roman periods. The divining spoons I mentioned, always found in pairs, the bowls completely plain, but the handles decorated in symbolic Latin art, as though it was important to have the art where the hands would hold them, to possibly to make spiritual charging between the object itself and the people who were holding them. And then we have the early Roman date Stanway doctor's grave with its set of divining rods, referenced as religious tools by Tacitus, and a vessel containing hallucinatory drugs, similar to the incense burners from the shrine at Chartres, found in 2005, whose inscribed surfaces actually contain the word Drew amongst lists of weird and obscure god names. The penultimate chapter examines evidence for gods and goddesses of Gallo-British origin, who are worshipped and sometimes definitely and sometimes possibly associated with the Druids. The Roman poet Lucan spoke of 3 gods whom he links with Druidic sacrificial practice: Taranis, Esus, and Teutates, all of whom are attested archaeologically. There is evidence too of dark arts, curses, and witchcraft, as at Iron Age Northampton and at Larzac in Gaul. The Northampton material consists of a 4th century BC grave of a woman who was bound hand and foot, placed in a grave face down, wearing a lead torque or neck ring that had been ritually broken and placed back to front around her neck. And one wonders whether this woman in life had been somebody particularly dangerous. And at Larzac, as in many other places, particularly in Gaul, we have long curse tablets that mention and reference divinities. The one at Larzac is fascinating because it's an all-female affair. You have a seeress called Severa Tertianigna. We have a goddess called Ad Saxona, the Dark One. And all the people who are being cursed, according to this inscription, are women and their pairs of women, foster mothers and foster daughters, all being cursed. An absolutely female affair. And in Gaul and Britain, deities imported from the Roman world, like Mercury and Minerva and so on, show signs of being manipulated and appropriated, alongside images and inscriptions attesting to native cults being introduced or just being given a voice for the first time, with the new technologies of worship brought in by the Romans, and syncretized sometimes with the pantheon of the conquerors, who are given a new Gallo-British identity. Some of these gods and goddesses exhibit shamanistic characteristics, such as gender crossing and skin turning. There is evidence that British and Gallic deities like Taranis and Meduginus continue to be venerated for centuries after Britain and Gaul became absorbed into the Roman Empire. The final chapter engages with expressions of life after death and reincarnation, described as Gallo-British traits by so many classical authors as having Druidic associations. The archaeological footprint of these beliefs must be sought in burial customs. Some graves provide vibrant, though enigmatic statements, like the Red Lady of Wetwine, the Iron Age female chariot burial of a woman who was covered in red coral and who had had a facial tumor by her nose, which was bright red and very disfiguring, but she'd been given the most amazing send-off at the age of 35 with a mirror joints of pork and lots of red coral, referencing perhaps the disfigurement. And another chariot burial from Yorkshire, the Pocklington chariot burial, which has a rider and leaping horses who are seeming to burst out of the grave. And then in Gaul, there is the chilling finding of the so-called ghost army of Gondal in south-central Gaul. 8 warriors, each with their horses, each with their right hand on the horses' heads, buried outside a settlement as though guarding it. In conclusion, to explain why I continue to find the Druids so fascinating, I'd like, if I may, to read you the final paragraph of the book. And so this book begins and ends with a Welsh cave. There is enough evidence of the Druids, or a similar group of powerful theocrats operating in Iron Age Gaul and Britain, to be confident not only in their existence, but also their continuance well into the Roman period in both provinces. The records of classical writers provide a framework within which the archaeological testimony can be placed. Ancient texts provide a considerable amount of information about the Druids, but also a lot of misinformation or even disinformation, fake news. Archaeological evidence is both firmer and more elusive than texts, capable of a raft of interpretations, particularly in the realms of religion and belief. So visitors to these realms, particularly in the remote past, will always stumble and stray off well-trodden paths as they venture into cave-like shadowlands. For us, the ancient Druids must always reside in these misty places, but the attempt of the journey to locate them remains utterly worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So now we move on to what I think is the main chunk of tonight's event, which is the in conversation element. So my colleagues Louis Rawlings, Paul Nicholson and Alan Lane have had the opportunity to read the book in advance of the launch, and hopefully now we'll engage in some interesting conversation around the key themes. So I think Louis was going to start off this portion.
Well, firstly, Miranda, thank you for writing such a wonderful book, and during those very dark days, as you said, it really strikes me that you've had less access to libraries, but somehow this has given you more freedom to make connections in your terms of your notes, your memories, between very different, diverse pieces of evidence. And I think focusing on the short Druidism of the classical period, and here we're talking really from the 2nd century BC, where we have Posidonius's testimony that survives in various fragments, right through to Ausonius in the 370s or so AD, I think is a wonderful way to treat the material. And the material, of course, is in terms of the classical sources that I'm interested in, are very wide-ranging in terms of the genre. We have histories of Caesar, of Tacitus, of Diodorus. We've got ethnographies that are partially embedded in other kinds of accounts, such as Caesar and Diodorus. We have poetry, Lucan and the very balmy but wonderful Silius Italicus, who I am an eternal fan of, but trust nothing he says about anything. And then, of course, we've got inscriptions which you delve very deeply into, and some of which I've not come across before, which was fantastic to be shown these. So my question really is, this sort of wide-ranging corpus of material is very difficult to treat as a singular entity because of all the different genres and the different nuances of those kinds of practices that these authors have had to go through in order to produce their works of art and their works of literature and their other creations. So I was just wondering whether you felt that the classical sources in a way help or hinder our interpretation of the archaeological material.
I think that they provide a scaffolding. I think without them, we'd be wandering around in a very muddy pool. We might come to the conclusion just from the archaeology that there's enough evidence from, for example, with things like shrines. There are so many shrines dating from the Iron Age, particularly the so-called war sanctuaries of Middle Gaul, like Gournay and Ribemont, where there is such a lot of very powerful evidence for powerful, managed, controlling clergy, because some of the rituals are repetitive, they're extremely intricate and enigmatic, and it really would go against reason to think that these were shrines which were just plonked in the countryside and then people came along and just did things at random. So I do think that the archaeology has a chance of standing on its own, but it has a much better engine if it has the classical sources, whether they're things that one disagrees with, or whether they are things that one can actually see as being married to the archaeology. So I think it's a very mixed bag, but I think without the classical sources, it would be a much more muddy pool and a much more shadowy picture that we can give. One of the interesting things about the classical sources, is quite new to me, reading work by people like Andrew Fitzpatrick and Antti Lampinen, where they talk about things like trophy sites, which again we can identify with not only the Gallic sites like Gournay, but now it's suggested that we might even look at Clinkerry Bark like that maybe, as well as being a ritual site, it was a trophy site, where the offerings, the martial equipment may not have been the property of those that organised the shrine, but the property of perhaps prisoners of war. And so I think it's very nice that sometimes the archaeology can drive the classical world as well as the other way around.
I think that's really interesting, and what often that does, though, is it suggests parallels back in the classical world. So when you're talking about deposition of weapons in managed places, one immediately thinks of Roman temples that are bedecked with the spoils of war and particularly Gallic equipment and armor. And also, places like Delphi, which are full of not Roman, but Greek hoplite equipment and things like that, which are dedicated to the gods and are tithes of the spoils of war. So I think there's some really interesting parallels to draw on in that respect as well. When you were talking about Caesar as being generally accepted now as a problematic source, because he's a politician, he's full of spin, he is living in a world of conquest, so his engagement with the Gauls is very much a antagonistic one to a certain extent, because he also has collaborators and colluders on his side as well, which are often forgotten about. And he is obviously thinking in terms of his audience when he's writing his commentary. So he's talking to a Roman audience, which was quite a complex Roman audience, mainly an elite audience of friends and enemies, but also the general populace as well, because we think these commentaries, or at least versions of them, were read out to bigger audiences. And Caesar was a popularist politician as well, so he's got all these multiple audiences. But of course, in order to explain what he is encountering and experiencing, he has to talk in terms that his audience can understand. His explanations, therefore, are pitched at trying to make equations of similarity in terms of a way of interpreting and understanding the world. But of course, he's also got the veneer of Latin. He's got his own mindset and he's got his own approach. But I think you're very, very sensible to take the line that he is there for 10 years and he's not walking around Gaul with his eyes closed, that he is clearly experiencing Gallic society at multiple times in multiple ways. And I think that gives us a reason to be confident about at least taking his observations about Gauls and Gallic society and Gallic religion seriously. So I think that I think I am agreeing with you, but I think there is this issue of how confident we can be about how we engage with classical sources who have their own worldviews and their own sort of mindsets. And I was just wondering whether you thought that you make quite a big play of Lucan, for example, and his description of a grove that Caesar encounters. And I wonder whether you'd come across any other thinking about Lucan and his approach to the superstitious aspects of his subject. And I'm thinking of a visit to a witch in Thessaly at one point, and her kind of setting, but also in terms of the way that he draws a really interesting parallel between Pompey at the very beginning of his poem as an oak tree and Caesar as a flash of lightning. And Caesar is going to be the victor, but he's also the person who is that Lucan doesn't actually like in this. He's the villain of the poem. But Pompey is kind of the solid, almost druid-like grove that Caesar then attacks. I don't know whether you come across that. What your thoughts are about these kind of cross-genre.
It's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, I know more about the comments Lucan about these three Gallic gods, and it's tempting just to dismiss them as being sort of made up names, until you realise that although there are not very many examples of archaeology that agree with Lucan, they are there. We've got an altar from Chester dedicated to Taranis, one of his gods. We've got the pillar from Paris, the Cluny monument, set up in the reign of Tiberius and by AD 26, that actually mentions Aethus by name, and he appears again at Trier. And then Teutates, often translated as the sort of god of the tribe or god of the people. Again, there's a smattering of material on pottery and on rings, things like that, Lucan is not, he is a poet, yes, and he's bigging up human sacrifice and how awful the Druids are, but he's got a vein of reality in terms of particularly these three gods. But I think I haven't read all of Lucan as well as I should have, and I think the idea of the analogy between sort of Pompey and Caesar is absolutely brilliant.
And I think that this is the thing about poetry, isn't it? Particularly this kind of historical epic poetry that particularly people of the age of Nero were really interested in producing. So we've got both Lucan and Silius Italicus. They've got this kind of edge of crazy, but there's also these kind of they're pumping their own sources, their own learning, their reading of events from whatever historical sources they have access to, and their own experiences and conversations with people, other members of the elite. And then they're creating this kind of Virgilian, Homeric kind of thing on top, with a particularly slightly balmy Neronian twist to it all as well. And I think that's something that we've yet to kind of really start scratching at, in terms of how these things then, how we can then use those effectively to understand the cultures that the as it were, the bedrock of the information is coming from.
Indeed, and one of what you were saying earlier about Caesar, having to put a Roman gloss on things in order that the Senate and whoever else was reading his material would actually understand it. And of course, the classic example of that is his description of the Roman gods in Gaul, which can't have been worshipped in Gaul in the 50s BC, because Gaul wasn't conquered yet. And yet, according to Caesar, they worship Jupiter and Mercury and Mars and whoever, and it's quite impossible that should have happened. So again, it's very much he's making a really good attempt to try and understand what he's being told in Gaul, perhaps by people like Diviciacus, about Gaulish religion. But I'm also aware that I think that, as in many arcane priesthoods all over the world, I've mentioned as an example the Dogon of Mali, who let missionaries into some of the secrets until they thought they were ready to take any more secrets. And I think in a way with Caesar, he's perhaps been given him sort of a little snippets of information or even disinformation, and then perhaps a little more and a little more. But he's never going to get to grips with the centrality of the arcaneness of Gallic religion, because he is a foreigner and it's not appropriate for him to know these things.
And he's also not interested, he's working in a political sphere, and he's thinking politically about the Druids, and he's thinking politically about his own perception of his own conquest. So I utterly agree with that. Thanks, Miranda.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it's my turn. I'm Alan Lane, and I'm not sure if Ben explained. I'm recently retired, but I'm not an Iron Age specialist, and my early medieval is my kind of period. But I have to say how great it is to see you, Miranda. Not quite in the flesh. It's a real shame we can't do this live, and I'm hoping if things get better, and I won't make any comments about government management, but then we may be able to meet in open groups soon. I read the book with great interest, and I thought a number of things. One, I wondered if you felt that the way archaeology has changed in archaeological interpretation since we both studied back last century, the influence of both anthropology and the interest in symbolism, the changing attitudes to interpretation have kind of made it much more possible to write the kind of book that you are now writing, and to draw together, as you say, scaffolding from classical sources, which we can all poke holes in, but nevertheless seem to fit with significant aspects of the archaeology.
You're absolutely right, Alan. I do remember way back in the sort of Neolithic, when I was doing my undergraduate degree at Cardiff, and I remember once, I think in the third year, our erstwhile colleague Mike Jarrett made the mistake of asking our third year group if there was any particular topic that we would like him to cover. And I put my hand up and said, "Oh, yes, please, sir, I'd like you to talk about religion." And he went, "No," which was quite interesting. But no, you're quite right. It's because I think I grew up and was a student in the era where ritual was regarded as the rag bag in which you put everything you couldn't understand. And it was rather denigrated because of that. And that went right through for a very, very long time. And it's only comparatively recently, say in the last 20 years or so, that the idea of anthropology and theory and those kind of intermingled disciplines have given archaeology and archaeological interpretation such incredible richness. So I'm glad I'm still here at the moment to be able to enjoy that.
I mean, as well as changing attitudes, there's also been really interesting archaeological discoveries. And I was particularly interested in your mention of this 2005 excavation at Chartres, which sounded really very exciting.
It does. I hesitate to overinterpret the site, but I don't know how much you know about it, but it was an underground shrine which had been preserved. And they were constructing a car park in the centre of Chartres, and they found the remnants of a burnt out house, and the collapse of the house preserved the cellar underneath, which turned out to be a very esoteric shrine with these 4 incense burners, all with inscriptions citing weird, otherwise completely unknown and unintelligible god names. And right in the middle of them is the word DRU, and we know from the inscriptions that the priest was a chap called Gaius Varius Sedatus, who probably, because the shrine dates to the late 1st, early 2nd century AD, because he had 3 names, was probably a Roman citizen. And I think he was probably a pillar of the Chartres establishment in the day, and then at night sort of went downstairs to his underground shrine, sort of donned a wizard's cloak and started this wonderful stuff. And I do wonder whether he's reinventing, sort of digging up and sort of brushing off the Druids and reinventing them to be something else. I really don't know. But it is a fascinating site because it's got all sorts of Eastern connotations as well. It's got some very strange pottery, which is more like to do with Egyptian witchcraft than anything else. But it is a fascinating site, and it does, I think, I'm right in saying that it's the only discovered inscription which possibly mentions Druids. And that in itself is exciting.
You also talk about the historical sources from the 4th century suggesting that Ausonius's family, that people by this stage were quite happy to claim druidical background. So the horror stories of the Druids have either passed or at least within some certain circles. So do you think this is a sign that Druidism was continuing as an underground movement, or is it just attitudes have changed?
I think Druids, I make a parallel in the book between the Druids during the Roman period, particularly in the later Roman period, and what happened to the shamans of Siberia and Russia during communist Russia, where they remained as a subtext, as it were, persecuted, vilified, but remaining working sort of underground, as it were. And I do wonder whether Druids survived, or whether it's just a romantic reinvention by Ausonius, which is really nothing more than a piece of poetry. But what interests me, because we have the Augustan histories, which are very dodgy, but they're sort of 3rd century, and it's interesting that there are a number of later Roman emperors that are mentioned in the Augustan histories as having been predicted to get the purple by not only Gallic Druids, but actually Druidesses. And so Diocletian, Numerian, Tiberius Alexander, and Diocletian, I think, they were all predicted, according to the Augustan histories, to attain the purple because of the predictions and the prophecies of Gallic Druidesses. Now, I think all that is to do with making sure that the would-be emperors had a sort of solid base, as it were. But it does mean that Druids remained in the consciousness. They hadn't died out in terms of memory. And that's what I think is important.
Your book has obviously been very, very disciplined in not speculating early and sort of not following kind of out of the Roman period. I mean, I wonder about the Irish sources. I think the term Druid does appear within Irish laws, I mean, which suggests, I mean, my understanding they are seen as being quite wide-ranging practitioners within the Irish laws.
They do. What I don't know is what the pedigree of that is in terms of ancientness. Right. There is clearly a lot of congruence between what's going on in Iron Age Ireland and what's going on in Iron Age Britain and Gaul, and things like bog bodies where there are bogs is a case in point. But my wondering is, because most of the people who were writing certainly the mythological stuff in the 8th and 9th centuries in Ireland were clerics who were well versed in the classical world, whether or not you're getting a spin by clerics to introduce Druids to Ireland. I very purposely did not mention Irish Druids because the evidence is much more fragmentary. We don't have the classical literature that talks about Ireland in those terms. And I thought that I would keep the book completely focused on areas where the classical writers give us Druids. Yeah. So, and I do occasionally stray into other areas, but very, very rarely. And I'm mindful, for example, of Caesar saying of Germany, they don't have Druids. So I didn't talk about them. But Ireland, I think, is a different issue altogether. You get Druids mentioned in Ireland in the myths and in the laws. You get Druids mentioned very occasionally in the Welsh mythology as well, but they're not really fleshed out in any way. So I must say that I'm skeptical of the making a very close link between Ireland in the Iron Age and Roman period and the mainland of Britannia and Gaul. And it's a shark-infested water as far as I'm concerned. Best avoided.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure the book is nevertheless very, very impressive. So thank you for talking.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Alan, and hi, Miranda. It's very nice to see you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Nicholson, and I teach mainly in the area of Egyptian archaeology. So this is well outside my normal comfort zone. That said, I have to say how much I enjoyed reading the book. It's a very readable work, and I learned a lot since I think the last thing I'd looked at on Druids was probably Stuart Piggott's book from when I was a student. So there was lots of new and exciting information in your book. One thing that interested me particularly was this idea that the Druids are central to Britannia and to Gallia, and as you've just said, we don't have them apparently in Germania. But where does Druidism or the Druids come from? Are they a codification of religious practices that existed earlier, or do you think they are a new religion, a new cult that somehow arises in Britain or Gaul at this time, that they're a new development?
Very difficult to say. I think Druids probably would have arrived at a time, whenever that was, when religion itself began to be codified and better managed and better integrated between tribes. We have Caesar telling us that the Druids actually were invented in Britain and moved thence to Gaul. We've got Pliny saying exactly the opposite, that they were in Gaul first and then came to Britain. And one of the things that I tried to do in this book was to make the comment that it's not clear that all the evidence for priests that I'm dealing with, they may not have called themselves Druids. We don't know, because we don't have the texts which give self-determination to people living in Britain and Gaul. So we don't know about that sort of thing. I suspect that that a set of religious people who were very, very powerful existed from at least the 3rd or 2nd century BC in Gaul and Britain. Where they picked up the name or were given the name is something that we will never know. But whether everybody that I've been dealing with in the book was a Druid or not, we only have the word Druid for the priests of Gaul and Britain. We don't have any other names. We have Sacerdos, sometimes used by Caesar, but we don't have any other sort of Druid names, as it were. So to what extent they were Druids themselves were a classical invention, to what extent they existed as a self-determined group in Iron Age Gaul and Britain is something that we will never know. What I think one can say is that there is a lot of unification of practice over quite some period of time and space as well, which gives the impression that there's an organized clergy going on, whatever they call themselves.
Thank you. No, it was interesting to think of them as well in terms of, for example, the way that shamans still practice in places like Mongolia and elsewhere in Eurasia, where you have a whole series of different belief systems, but then you've got codification of particular groups and perhaps a less literary tradition on top of that. I'm thinking, for example, the Mongolian shamans existing alongside Buddhism and other religions within Mongolia, and they all coexist side by side. Some of the same people who practice Buddhism are also believers in shamanism. The divisions seem much less clear-cut than we are perhaps used to in our own society, as thinking of religious groups as being mutually exclusive. And I think sort of what you're saying is that the Druids are bringing together and codifying aspects of religion that perhaps been much more varied in the past, but you've still got another layer possibly of different practice taking place elsewhere within Britannia and within Gallia.
I think that's absolutely right, Paul. There are stratifications, I think, of people, and with the Druids that we hear about from people like Caesar suggests that they were highly educated, that they were very powerful politically, as well as religiously. And in some cases, for example, with Diviciacus, she's his friend, who was both religious leader and political leader. So they were not mutually exclusive. And the same might be true of Boudica, we don't know. But I think the substrate of shamanism is very important. I think it explains the art, it explains the complexities and surreality of Latin art, to have that sort of thing, the shape-shifting, the skin-turning, the gender crossing, all of that is really important in many shamanistic societies. And the idea of soul flight, so you take on another persona of an animal or something in order to negotiate with the spirits. So I'm sure there were lots and lots of priest groups, but probably many of them, except perhaps for the people who were doing the cursing, possibly we can recognize them as another substrate of sort of under the blanket religion, as it were. But we don't normally have the footprint that we have for the more theocratic, higher echelon priesthoods. But of course, again, what's in a name? We really don't know what's going on. We don't know whether perhaps somebody who was in charge of a rural shrine in the middle of Northamptonshire classified himself or herself as a druid or not. It may have been that they were confined to the bigger centres. We don't know. And the classical writers are very quiet about that sort of thing, about that sort of detail. We just don't have that scaffolding to let us get into the detail of how it all was managed.
Great, thank you very much. Just seeing a note from Ben saying that can we open all up to the floor as well, because there are questions coming in there. So I'll hand over to Ben to chair the questions from the floor. Thanks, Miranda.